He lied, and they believed him. They stripped away my name, my work, my truth, and you let them. I begged you to speak, to show them I wasn't the monster they said I was. But maybe you already chose your side, didn't you, God? The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast a cold, sterile glow, but for Emily Carter, they illuminated her world. At 26, Emily was a registered nurse whose compassion was as vital as the IV drip she managed. She was the kind of nurse who lingered to hold a trembling hand, the one who remembered a patient's favorite flower. Her life was simple, lived in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, her budget tight, but her heart full. Poverty was a familiar companion, yet it never eclipsed her inherent goodness. She had an unwavering belief in two things: the inherent goodness of people and the constant, loving presence of God. Every night, kneeling beside her narrow bed, she would whisper her prayers, a sincere, earnest plea for strength and for justice in the world. She truly believed the divine was always listening. Thank you for today's strength, Lord. Help me to see the good in everyone, even when it's hard, she'd pray, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. However, St. Mary's held a shadow. Dr. Alastair Mason, the head of the cardiology department. Mason was a man whose ambition was only outmatched by his arrogance. He operated under a cloak of seniority, quick to find a scapegoat for the inevitable errors in a demanding hospital environment. And lately, that scapegoat was frequently Emily. If a chart was misfiled, it was Emily. If a minor delay occurred, it was Emily's lack of focus. Mason found a perverse satisfaction in undermining her, perhaps because her genuine kindness was a stark contrast to his own calculated coldness. She bore the slights in silence, clinging to her faith. Don't let bitterness take root, Emily, she'd remind herself. God sees the truth. The equilibrium of Emily's life shattered on a crisp October morning. A long-term affluent patient, Mr. Silas Thorne, passed away unexpectedly. The atmosphere in the ICU instantly shifted from routine to crisis. Dr. Mason, his face a mask of false concern, immediately cornered Emily. "Nurse Carter," he hissed, pulling her into an empty storage closet, his voice low and menacing. "The dosage was incorrect on the 7:00 a.m. round. Your round. This patient had known sensitivities. You documented it wrong." Emily stared at him, bewildered. "No, doctor. I double-checked Mr. Thorne's chart. I verified it with Nurse Peterson. I administered the correct—" "Silence!" Mason cut her off, his eyes flashing with a desperate urgency. "This is a high-profile case. I need to contain the damage. You will take responsibility for the clerical error. It's an easy fix. A written warning, maybe a brief suspension. Better than an investigation that implicates the department, wouldn't you agree?" But this wasn't an easy fix. The ensuing internal investigation, orchestrated by Mason, was a sham. He twisted the documented facts, had intimidated her colleagues into silence, and produced witnesses who claimed to have seen Emily rush the medication. Within 48 hours, the hospital administration announced its findings. Gross negligence by Nurse Emily Carter. She was summarily suspended, then terminated. The impact was devastating. Her colleagues, fearful of Mason's power, averted their eyes. Friends offered weak, generic condolences. The local media, eager for a scandal, tore her reputation to shreds. "Compassionate nurse turned killer," screamed one headline, Emily was not just jobless, she was an outcast. Her name, once a symbol of dedication, was now synonymous with failure. She sat alone in her apartment, the silence heavier than any noise. Her hand instinctively reached for her old, worn Bible, but her fingers stopped. One night, kneeling not to pray, but to challenge the vast emptiness, she cried out, her voice raw with betrayal. The tears flowed not just for her lost career, but for a lost conviction. If you're real, God, why do you stay silent when the innocent suffer? I gave you my whole life. I believed in your justice. Where are you now? The silence that followed was terrifying, crushing her spirit beneath its weight. She felt truly abandoned, adrift in a world where cruelty triumphed over truth. Emily spent weeks in a fog of despair, surviving on canned soup and the painful memories of a life that no longer existed. She stopped leaving her apartment. Her faith was not just shaken, it was pulverized. The turning point came not in a dramatic flash, but in a quiet persistence. A local parish priest, hearing about the injustice, sought her out. Father Gabriel was a man whose eyes held the wisdom of 90 years and the kindness of a saint. He had a surprising past. He was a former military trauma surgeon, his hands now folded in prayer instead of wielded a scalpel. He found Emily on a park bench, her face pale, staring blankly ahead. He sat beside her, not speaking for a long time, just sharing the quiet space. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "You look like a soul wrestling with the divine, my child. Tell me, what has he done to disappoint you?" Emily wept, pouring out the whole agonizing saga. "He let them destroy me, Father. He let a liar win. I was wrong to believe." Father Gabriel nodded slowly, his gaze distant, then focused sharply back on her. "I've seen things in the trenches that would make you question everything, Emily. Chaos, unspeakable pain. But I learned this truth. Sometimes God lets us fall, not to break us, but to show the cracks that light can enter." He paused, letting the words settle. "You believe justice should arrive with a fanfare like a telegram from heaven. But justice often arrives in the quiet space of your own strength after you've had the courage to look for it." He then leaned closer, his tone conspiratorial. "You worked at St. Mary's. You know how meticulous they are with records, even after a crisis. Look back at the old hospital archives, Emily, the storage unit. The paper trail is just the surface. Don't be afraid of the truth. It fears only those who hide from it." His words were a jolt, a sudden electric surge of purpose. Emily realized she had been praying for God to fight her battle, when perhaps he had simply been giving her the courage to pick up her own sword. The next few days were a blur of nervous energy and clandestine investigation. Knowing the hospital's chaotic storage systems, Emily used her old security clearance codes to access the deep basement archives. The air was thick with the smell of dust and forgotten things. She wasn't looking for paper. She was following a hunch based on Dr. Mason's almost pathological need for control. She knew he had a habit of installing his own unregistered security measures. Tucked away on a high shelf behind a stack of obsolete medical equipment manuals, she found it, a small, outdated, and unplugged security camera. A glance showed the date was active around the time of Mr. Thorne's death. The camera contained an old-school data card. Her hands shaking, Emily rushed to a public library computer. She inserted the card and opened the file. The video was grainy, soundless, and perfectly damning. It was the early morning of Mr. Thorne's death. Dr. Mason entered the room, his movements quick, confident. He checked the chart, the one Emily had already signed off on. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he administered an additional dose from a different vial, a vial that Emily, the meticulous nurse, knew contained the specific, powerful medication Mr. Thorne was critically allergic to. Mason then pocketed the vial, wiped the counter, and exited. He had planned to blame an inevitable reaction on Emily's oversight, but the patient's sudden, rapid deterioration forced him to move faster and throw her under the bus completely. A cold, righteous fury settled over Emily. This was not a clerical error. This was murder. She carefully copied the file, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She immediately called Father Gabriel and then the police, requesting a discreet meeting. The confrontation had to be now. Emily walked into St. Mary's one final time, the data card burning a hole in her pocket. She marched straight to Mason's lavish corner office. The door was ajar. "Dr. Mason," she said, her voice steady and steel-edged, a tone he had never heard from her before. Mason looked up, his jaw dropping in shock. "How dare you trespass here, Carter? Get out before I call security." Emily stepped forward, placing a single, unreadable medical manual on his desk. "I know why Mr. Thorne died." Mason paled, a flicker of panic crossing his eyes before he masked it with contempt. "You're delusional. Get out." "No," Emily countered, her eyes locking onto his. "You knew he was allergic, and you did it anyway. You wanted to test a new protocol for an early discharge, and you needed to silence Mr. Thorne's complaints. You needed him gone, and you used me as your shield." Mason burst out laughing, a hollow, bitter sound. "You found some papers? Some old gossip? You think anyone will believe you now, Emily? The media has painted you as a dangerous pariah. I'm an esteemed physician. Your word against mine is dust." He reached for his phone. Emily's eyes were glistening, but she was not crying tears of fear. They were tears of final, liberating truth. She raised her voice, letting it fill the room. "I don't need them to believe me. God saw it, and He sent me back for this." Mason's eyes darted to the manual on his desk, the one that had shielded the forgotten camera. He understood. He lunged across the desk toward her, his face contorted with rage, desperate to grab the data card. "You little fool! I'll crush you!" he screamed. Just as Mason's fingers brushed her arm, the office door flew open. Standing there were two stern police detectives, Father Gabriel, his military bearing strangely resurfacing, and the hospital's chief of security, who had been alerted by Father Gabriel's urgent call. "Dr. Mason," the detective said, his voice cold, "we have been provided with compelling evidence. You are under arrest for the intentional homicide of Silas Thorne." Mason slumped, the fight draining from him, his arrogance collapsing into pathetic despair. Emily watched him being led away, a profound sense of exhaustion and quiet triumph washing over her. In the aftermath, the hospital's public apology was immediate, vast, and humiliating. The original verdict was overturned. Emily Carter's name was cleared, her honor restored, the media now eager to hail her as a hero. The hospital offered her a substantial settlement and her old job back, with a raise and a promotion. She accepted the settlement, but not the job. "I cannot return to be just a nurse, not after this," she explained to the chief administrator. "I must be something more." Using the settlement money, Emily didn't buy a fancy car or a luxurious home. She opened the Gabriel Foundation, named for the priest who saved her. Its mission was to provide legal and emotional support for hospital staff unfairly targeted and silenced by institutional power. Her experience had shown her the true cracks in the system, and she was determined to shine a light on them. She was not rich, but she was fulfilled. Her new purpose was far greater than the one she had lost. One evening, Emily stopped by the hospital chapel. She stood alone before the crucifix, the polished wood glowing softly in the candlelight. She didn't kneel. She just stood, looking up at the figure of Christ, the image of suffering and ultimate triumph. She reached out and lightly touched the cool marble base, a gentle, understanding smile on her lips. The silence was no longer terrifying. It was peaceful, like a sacred conversation. "I thought you abandoned me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat with residual emotion. "I thought you stayed silent when I needed you most. But you weren't silent. You were just waiting for me to believe again, waiting for me to learn what I was capable of." Emily Carter's story became a quiet legend at St. Mary's. The themes of her journey resonated deeply with those who heard it. Faith is not the belief that God will shield you from suffering, but the conviction that He has a reason for letting you walk through it. Justice does not always arrive quickly, but it arrives precisely when the heart is finally ready to wield the truth. The fall had not broken her. It had refined her. She had been polished by pain, her soul prepared for a calling far larger than she had ever imagined.